When most of us think of anxiety, we think of a panic attack, shortness of breath. For some of us, it's the feeling of, I'm going to die. Our brains freeze, we become flustered and discombobulated. And when we think of nervous energy, what exactly comes to mind? Is it that extra part of ourselves that often wants to double check things that feel important? Which is fine till everything starts to feel important and we can't literally double check everything. More importantly, why has our age often been referred to as the age of anxiety, where anxiety is increasing even among small children? But what if we did not need to stamp out our anxiety entirely? What if there existed powerful tools to help us harness anxiety and channel it in a productive way? Channel it specifically for success. What if the solution to anxiety lay in practical solutions you could master with a bit of discipline and repetition? And in the process, a great deal of self-knowledge would be uncovered. Well, let's find out how this is possible. I and my next guest will uncover the secret to mastering anxiety and much, much more in this episode of The Jason Hill Show. I am Jason Hill, and if you're a fan of The Jason Hill Show and wish to donate, please do click on the link below and follow the instructions. My guest today is Dr. Chloe Carmichael, who is a clinical psychologist in private practice and the author of an absolutely amazing new book called Nervous Energy: Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. You may have seen her on ABC's Nightline, Inside Edition, CNN, VH1, and other media outlets where she's known as Dr. Chloe. Dr. Chloe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your book. I spent the entire weekend I didn't skim it. I read it and I started doing some of the exercise and I devoted the entire weekend to reading it and I benefited from it. Before we talk a bit about the book, we won't give away all of the book because we don't want to disincentivize folks from buying it. I want to ask you, what is going on in our society? I've been a professor in the classroom now for 27 years. And without being hyperbolic, I keep up with the studies, I keep up with what's going on in the research. And I think my kids are keeling over from anxiety, as are a lot of college kids, even K through 12 students. We see more students and children on anti-anxiety drugs more than at any other time in our history. So what's happening, Dr. Chloe? What's going on with our society and our children?
Wow, Jason, I feel like the question is almost more like what isn't going on with our society and our children, right? The number of challenges. So I'm just going to rattle off a list of things that I think are probably contributing to this, spike in anxiety and mental health issues and all kinds of other things that we are seeing in our young people. I would start with screen time. Right. So as we all know, the more time that we spend in front of a screen, that's time that we're not really interacting with people. And it's especially for children and teenagers, interacting with people is a big part of how they discover and develop their identity and learn how to emotionally regulate. So when we interrupt that with screen time, I think is an issue. Moreover, where what's on that screen is oftentimes social media, which is interrupting and interfering, of course, with their ability to, have sustained attention. There's these pop-up ads and social comparison on steroids. So there's the whole screen factor. And then when we especially think about, children and teens, I think we also have to think about identity factors, right? So everything from, whether you're a boy or a girl to what we are going to infer by the color of your skin, all kinds of these issues about identity are now becoming so politicized that I think it's very stressful for young children. I think it's stressful even for adults, but for children and teenagers, I think a lot of these things are kind of being put on them in ways that are almost impossible for them to understand. Now, I warned you I have a list. So just to move on with that, there's also religion. So religiosity, the degree to which somebody is religious, has been shown to be a protective factor in mental health. It almost doesn't even matter the religion. It's just the fact of religion has been shown to help people and center people. Again, whether some people are into even meditation, but religion is on the decline. So I think it's important to notice that too. Another thing that's actually, kind of out of vogue is discipline, right? So whether it be at home or even at school, it's practically illegal to discipline children now. And what we actually know is that children respond to limits. Limits are actually soothing. Limits are boundaries, as well as being around other children who are disciplined, who are bounded. When the children themselves don't have boundaries or they're forced to be around a bunch of other children without boundaries, that can be very stressful. Finally, of course, there's the issue of putting all of our young people in a mask for several years and surprise, surprise, that, had a negative effect on them. I was shocked that it was taboo to discuss that. And then finally, we have the fact that big pharma would love to medicalize and monetize every feeling of distress that anybody has instead of, actually teaching them how to sustain themselves and work with their feelings. So that's my list, Jason.
It's an incredible list, and there's so much to sort of pick up on it. But I like to sort of kid my students and say that we live in a sort of trauma economy where there's certain things that bring us anxiety, and there's certain things that upset us that are the normal course of life. I know I was born and raised in Jamaica, and there were certain things that were nerve-wracking, like failing a test, and our teachers would tell us, you have a democratic right to fail, and you have a chance to recoup your failure by doing well on the next exam. And what I see happening, of course, in our culture is that to tell a student you have a democratic right to fail is next to committing heresy. It's so when I talk about the trauma economy, it's like every single facet of a person's life in which he or she experiences some degree of nervousness or trauma, or trauma is too hyperbolic a term. Any set of discord in his or her psyche is is exaggerated and is catastrophized. And
100%.
right. And so kids don't have a normal way of really organically working out their feelings and their sense of being upset. It's traumatized by our trauma economy, and an added layer of distress is already placed upon them. Um, I wonder if you could say something before we get to your book about how the trauma industry got to be where it is today as a psychologist. How do you see? Because when I came to America in 1985 at the age of 20, I would not have I would the self-esteem movement was on the rise, but I would not have characterized America as part of a trauma economy as I would today.
Definitely. So, kind of along those lines, as you were saying about, young people and them not, having the right to fail, because that would be, a trauma, and then, connecting that into this trauma economy. I want to connect that as well to the bullying culture, right? The anti-bullying movement. Um, so of course nobody's in favor of bullying, but to your point, I think, you can look at somebody sideways and they can feel as if, they have been bullied. And, to your point about, engaging in struggle, failing a test, or even enduring somebody at school who's not very nice to you, if we have to externalize that and label it as a trauma, or as a mental illness or whatever, depending on the situation, what we're actually doing is we're undercutting that student's or that person's ability to build self-efficacy, their ability to feel like they can handle challenges, or in the case of coming back and getting an A on that test because they don't want to fail it, we're undermining, their sense of meritocracy, right? Which again is actually anxiety reducing when people can feel a sense of control, that their own efforts are going to predict their outcome. And, as you said, the trauma economy, I think that connects very closely to the victim economy. And again, connecting that, with this whole anti-bullying thing, for example, in my training as a clinical psychologist, I don't work with children now, but in my training, sometimes I would, and I would sometimes be asked to work, with students from extremely fancy prep schools that were, supposedly being bullied. And as I would sit and learn from them about what was really going on, I would often learn that they were actually needling the other person, that the supposed victim was actually a very passive aggressive person who was kind of enjoying, pulling the strings of the supposed bully. Now, the bully was often no angel either. But at the end of the day, it was really basically two people that were needling each other. But one of them was in the trauma economy, was winning because she had managed, or he had managed, to paint themselves as the victim. So, I mean, again, I think it's probably all started out very well intentioned. I remember as a trainee psychologist, again, being kind of surprised at the way trauma would be used to describe, what I actually personally always thought were sometimes just minor upsets. And I think, maybe to be generous, the labeling certain things as trauma was probably intended to try to really honor and recognize people's pain. But again, I think the flip side is that we begin to undermine people's sense of self-efficacy and resiliency if we go too far with that.
Which leads us into your book. And again, folks, the book by Dr. Chloe is Nervous Energy: Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. If we take this trauma economy seriously, and we deprive children, especially of who are going to one day grow into adults, of working out their own anxieties in organic ways, that is building resiliency and tenacity. You write a lot about high functioning people that are prone to anxiety, and you also write about low functioning people. Um, you write in the book that you prefer working with high functioning people. For our listeners, first, can you tell our listeners what is a high functioning person, what is a low functioning person, and why do you particularly like working with high functioning individuals?
Sure. And I just want to start by saying, to be very clear, I do like working with higher functioning people better than lower functioning people. That doesn't mean I actually like higher functioning people better than lower functioning people. I want to be very clear about that. Many of the most wonderful people I know are lower functioning in the sense that, maybe perhaps you think of somebody that has a severe cognitive disability who is not able to live independently. I know people like that, for example, through my church and in my life, and I love them with all my heart, and they are wonderful people. And Bernie Madoff, for example, might be considered a higher functioning person, but I would never want to spend a minute with him. So I just want to be very clear that it's a clinical interest that I like working with higher functioning people just because of my particular style of clinical work. It works well with that group, but it's not a moral judgment or a value judgment. So with that said, in psychology terms, a higher functioning person is basically somebody who is able to take care of their own basic needs. So they can set an alarm clock and be somewhere on time. They can hold down a job. They can have a couple of basic, relationships in their life and, maybe even do a little something extra like volunteer somewhere or have some hobbies. They can run their own life. And again, honestly, even somewhat by necessity, when I was starting my private practice, I kind of needed to work with higher functioning people because those are the types of people that are able to abide typically by the policies of a private practice where we hold a 24-hour cancellation policy and things like that. Now, a lower functioning person might be somebody, like I said, who perhaps has a cognitive barrier that they just cannot do those things. And that's it. That's okay. It's just I tend to be the type of person who likes to give homework and keep raising the bar. And for whatever reason, the higher functioning set just clicked better with my clinical style. But lower functioning people could also include, for example, somebody that has a severe substance abuse disorder or somebody who has depression or anxiety to the point where they have thoughts of hurting themselves or others. And again, I'm not trying to say that those people are not as valuable. It's just that I, as a clinician, didn't feel like I had the tools to help as much. And so my work has always just focused on what we might call garden variety New Yorkers, which is where my practice was and is.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want to talk to Dr. Chloe about some of the techniques but more importantly, why are higher functioning people more prone to anxiety? We are talking to Dr. Chloe Carmichael, who is known as Dr. Chloe. Her book is Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. You're listening to The Jason Hill Show, and I'm Jason Hill, and we're going to take a very short break, and we'll be right back. We are back talking to Dr. Chloe, and her book is Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. You should get this book, even if you don't suffer from anxiety, and you probably do. You all probably do. It's a good book to gift to someone who suffers from anxiety. So if you're not going to buy it for yourself, and they're wonderful exercises that you can work through. I've been working through some of them myself because I have a lot of nervous energy. I'm a type A personality, and so you guys can buy this. You can gift it to a relative or a friend. So Dr. Chloe, I want to briefly read something, a passage from the book, which is really quite well written, and it's very clear. You said, high functioning people are often so good at powering through their to-do list without getting bogged down by emotions that they often disconnect from the emotions entirely. This can lead to procrastination, a sense of depletion, or just an avoidant attitude around certain things on their to-do list for reasons they don't understand. This may turn into a negative spiral if they start getting down on themselves for not accomplishing certain things on their list, when the reasons they're not doing those things in the first place is because they actually need support rather than self-criticism. So if you're feeling anything less than energized around your to-do list, try checking out the to-do list with emotions exercise yourself. So why are higher functioning people, I guess part of the answer lies in the quote if people will read the preceding paragraph, but why particularly are higher functioning people more prone to anxiety? Is it just a matter that they're more ambitious and driven and maniacally driven than lower functioning people?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say it's even a particular nature of anxiety that I see in high functioning people. Because just to be clear, a lower functioning person could also have anxiety, but they just might have anxiety that is so bad that they literally cannot leave their house unless a mobile crisis unit comes and coaxes them out step by step by step. So it's not that lower functioning people don't have anxiety, but higher functioning people, they tend to have, at least in my experience, a particular type of experience with anxiety where it's a little bit more what psychologists call neurotic, where like we're still functioning, we're still running around, we're still living our lives, but our mind is maybe just kind of working a little bit overdrive. And as you pointed out, for example, in that passage that you just read, one of the things that high functioning people can do is actually put their emotions aside. We call it compartmentalizing in psychology. And it's actually a skill, right? To be able to suppose that you have to give a presentation. A higher functioning person will be able to not allow their nerves to overcome them because they're able to just, put their emotions aside if they feel scared and just step forward and do the presentation, which is a skill. However, high functioning people can get so good at putting their emotions aside that they might sometimes forget to reconnect back with them. Or they can be so productivity driven because we do get a dopamine hit when we accomplish something, and high functioning people can accomplish a lot. So they might get so addicted to just feeling productive, or their self-worth might tend to start coming through feeling productive to the point where they almost feel like it's indulgent to stop and notice and connect with their emotions. And that is when, as you said, that they might then start to feel a general sense of procrastination or a general sense of depletion, like they're a hamster on a wheel. They're doing all their tasks, but they're just not really feeling energized and connected with them. And that's why a technique like the to-do list with emotions, which is where it's a guided exercise to help you to not only reconnect with the emotion associated with the thing on your to-do list, but to also then layer in a self-care plan. And I know some of your listeners might be saying a self-care plan, but honestly, it makes sense. So for example, suppose that on your to-do list, was to reorganize your desk drawers, right? And you just been avoiding it. And, the emotion that went with it when you really thought about it was failure. And you would say, well, what is that? Why does that mean? Why do I feel that way? And then when you really took a moment to think about it, you might say, well, because I actually bought a whole bunch of these, office supplies, and I had these plans for this project I was going to do, and then I never did it. And so when I organize these desk drawers now, it brings up feelings of guilt or failure. So then your self-care plan would be to say, okay, well, I'm going to get myself some support with that. I'm going to bring in an organizer or even a coach for that project, just to either help me get back on track or help me come to peace with the fact that I've decided to switch paths and that project is no longer for me. But the idea that would be, again, an example of a self-care plan. I just want your listeners to know that self-care plans can actually be very practical and even productivity driven.
Right, right. There, yes, that is true. In your book, you have a breakdown of three common nervous energy profiles, and there's a sort of step-by-step direction for implementing each. You have a lot of techniques: the three-part breath, the zone of control, the mental shortlist, the mind mapping, the worry time, response prevention, thought replacement, and anchoring statements. No, like I said, I'm not going to ask you to talk about these because you'll just give away your book and nobody will buy it. So let's just deal with one, Dr. Chloe. One technique for dealing with this issue of anxiety and this issue of what to do with nervous energy. The one I really, really liked was, well, I liked all of them. I did. But the one that spoke to me, maybe because of where I sort of register on the continuum. is anchoring statements. Talk about anchoring statements. What's an anchoring statement, and who benefits most from it, and what is it meant as a corrective for?
Sure, absolutely. So, anchoring statements is something that's helpful for people whose mind sometimes just goes totally blank, which, honestly may not necessarily be everybody who's listening. So, if you're listening and you don't have the problem of your mind going blank, don't worry, there's plenty of other techniques in the book. But anchoring statements are really good for people whose mind actually tends to just go blank sometimes, almost as if they're kind of having a panic attack. And I use the word panic attack not really in the clinical sense here, but just more in the day-to-day sense, where people say, "Oh my gosh, I'm freaking out. I can't think. Oh my gosh, I'm having a panic attack." And it's like their mind almost loses the ability for language in those moments. And I will say that as a psychologist, what I often find for people who have that is that there's usually something underneath the surface that they're avoiding. And they've been kind of pushing the anxiety back and down. And then it ultimately kind of almost jams up the system in the form of just a total mind freeze or a total mind blank. But the anchoring statements is a technique that can help get you out of that situation. And people who do have that happen, they tend to have it happen, more than once. And so if you've ever had it happen before, what you would do is you would ask yourself, what words could I memorize that would help me to just simply reconnect with language when I get into that space, right? And so for some people, again, they actually think that they're having a heart attack and they're dying. I've gotten referrals from many emergency rooms and cardiologists before from people who thought that they were having a heart attack and dying, but they were really just having a little bit of a panic attack. And so for those types of people, they want to repeat to themselves a simple phrase like, "I've seen my doctor. I am medically fine. I will breathe." Just repeating those words. And the thing about the anchoring statements is that they will often sound so boring that they would bore you to tears in your normal life. And they're not intended for use in your normal life. They're actually intended to literally restart the language part of your brain. Because for some people, it's almost like the language part of their brain completely short circuits. And that in itself then becomes a source of anxiety in the moment, and it becomes a snowball effect. For other people, the phrase is something like, memorizing, "My head is above my shoulders are above my waist is above my hips are above my feet." And whatever it is, though, you have to be able to memorize it to the point where if I woke you up in the middle of the night, you could say it like the alphabet, because you have to be able to say it. And even some people carry it on a card or on their phone so that they can just pull it out in case of emergency.
Give us some more anchoring statements for people like you're in it. Like I can tell you why this resonates with me. You and I both do interviews, and I was in an interview. I think it was with Tucker Carlson, and I usually do really well. But he asked me something, and I had 30 seconds to answer it, and it was not part of my talking points, and I sort of blanked out, and I said, "Well, I only have 30 seconds, and we're going to have to come back and where I can explore in depth." I was so embarrassed. So, what would be like? Give us some more anchoring statements that would sort of anchor people who are just like blanking out.
Wow, that's a good one. I have to share a story back then with you. I was on the Nancy Grace show once, and I mispronounced a word, and I started to have a little bit of a panic attack myself. What I did was actually the 3-part breath right there as well. So when we do feel ourselves short circuiting, sometimes it's language, sometimes it's words, right? But another thing that can actually help people sometimes, and I like this, it's kind of a variation for people that get social anxiety. So suppose that, you're at an event and you suddenly get hit with like a total wave of self-consciousness. Instead of actually just having a particular anchoring statement that you rehearse to yourself, a different way that you can reactivate, the language part of your brain as well as the part of you that's connected to those around you is to just start silently naming the physical characteristics of the person that you are talking to, right? So I might say, like if I were speaking to you, I might say, oh, he's a man, he has short hair, his hair is dark, he's about such and such feet tall. And just by silently naming those features, it cognitively focuses me on you instead of on myself. And it challenges my brain to start naming very basic facts that are literally right in front of me. And it can actually help to kind of anchor people back in that moment socially when they have kind of a social panic attack.
So simple, eh? And right in front of us, but our brain is just wired to sort of not 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 go into that default position. It's very interesting. Um, I want to go to a place that you've spent some time on in your book, which I find very interesting. Against the backdrop of anxiety, are two phenomena that you talk about, which are the observing ego versus the experiencing ego, you're the guest, so why don't you explain to one is crucial for achieving what you call mindfulness or metacognition. Can you talk about what the observing ego is, what the experiencing ego is, and the value of the observing ego in terms of getting out of a state of anxiety and bringing us to a state of mindfulness?
Yes, absolutely. And since you mentioned mindfulness, I just want to kind of connect that for people who, again, might be listening saying, oh my goodness, mindfulness, is this like a yoga thing or what? But really what mindfulness is in the context of this conversation for me is mindfulness is about metacognition, which is the ability to be having an overall awareness of your thoughts so that you can start to notice if you are, for example, going into people pleasing mode, or whatever it is that you're doing in any particular moment, to have that self-awareness. So to connect that back to the observing ego and the experiencing ego, it's kind of actually drawing from more of the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic literature, where we have the experiencing ego is just the part of ourselves that is literally experiencing our feelings and our sensations. The perfect example of someone who's all experiencing ego is an infant who's hungry, right? The infant just screams with hunger. The infant doesn't have an awareness that he or she is hungry. They almost are the hunger, like they are living it. They feel merged with their experience and they don't really have an observing ego. They're just 100% experiencing ego. Now, on the other side, again, is that observing ego, right? So the part of us, maybe that is a grown adult who's, sitting waiting for an interview and suddenly realizes that, we're super hungry, right? And then we have the observing ego that might feel like, oh, gee, I have a hunger pang in my stomach, but I'm not at all panicked. I know what that is. It's something I've experienced before. And I even know, what I can do about it. And so as you can see, the more observing ego strength we have, the better able we are to understand ourselves and not be reactive to any given momentary feeling or impulse that we might have, because we have that metacognition, overarching self-awareness of ourselves.
Let me push a little bit, Dr. Chloe, on this because I think that's very, very helpful. But one could say if we're habituated to be in an experiencing egoic state, and we don't have someone saying, "Are you listening to yourself talk?" or "Come on, you're sounding like a raving, frantic maniac." How does someone who's in a 30-minute monologue or soliloquy, much of the horror of his friends, just talking, and not experiencing himself as, oh my God, I'm talking. I've been dominating this conversation for the last 30 minutes. How, what, what tricks of the trade can someone who is in that experiencing egoic state come to acquire uh, to be in the observing observing egoic state.
How do we increase our own ability, our own observing ego, or how do we
Yeah.
increase the observing ego of others? Which is the
Well,
question.
well, let's say that people are just too polite. And so what is it that we can do if we're not sort of socialized to be in that observing egoic state? What is it that we can do um, to get into that state, that observing egoic state? If we're just used to being in the experiencing egoic state, and we don't have people who will call us on it, and we're used to getting away with it, is there anything? Are there any tricks that we can?
Absolutely. Yes. So to increase our own ability, our own power of observing ego, that connects 100%, in my view, into metacognition, which is, again, the word I like to use almost in swap for mindfulness when I'm talking to intellectual people, just because I know that for a lot of intellectual people, they hear mindfulness and they think it's new agey, whereas actually, Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical School, many places have documented that mindfulness training, when done properly, actually really does, it reduces stress and it helps people to be more connected. And the reason why it does that, again, is because it gives people this metacognition, this bird's eye view of themselves, so that, like you said, suppose that you are that person, going on and on for a half an hour at a party, and you haven't, up until you started, doing metacognition and, the mindfulness metacognition exercises in my book that help people with that kind of thing. Let's suppose that you suddenly started doing that. And so you started having that bird's eye view of yourself. You would then not only be able to notice, okay, I've been talking for a half an hour dominating the conversation, but the real next step then, and I get into this in the book too, is that we want to have compassion with that. The next step is not to scold yourself. The next step is to congratulate yourself for having realized that there is something going on that you may want to work on, and then to become curious and to say, I wonder why I have been doing that. Have I been talking for a half an hour nonstop here because I feel like I have to entertain people in order for them to like me? Or am I talking so much because I'm afraid to let other people talk because there's something I'm concerned will come up? Like, to actually become curious about why you're doing it. And then maybe you would want to use one of the response prevention techniques or something else in the book to try to actually stop yourself from talking so much if you discover it's a bit of a compulsion. But certainly you can absolutely raise your self-awareness, your observing ego, by doing some of the mindfulness exercises, as well as, whether it's my book or some other book, by reading books that promote self-reflection and self-awareness.
So it's a trait that is not alien to our character. It's a trait that's endemic to being actually a human being that we all have. We just have to learn how to activate it, right? It's not alien to who we are.
Right. It's a skill that we can build. I mean, for a lot of people, even just going to therapy helps to build their metacognition, right? Because they sit there and they talk and they talk and they talk, and they start to hear themselves over time, and it starts to give them insight. Another way people can do it is to journal, what's going on in their head, and then, look back and review it. So all of those things will help develop your metacognition and self-awareness skills.
Fascinating. We're going to take another short break. When we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Chloe a little bit about herself, or where she's from, what got her into studying not just psychology, but anxiety in particular. I know she's interested in other things, and where she was educated. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. to the Jason Hill Show. I am Jason Hill. We are talking with Dr. Chloe Carmichael. You might know her as Dr. Chloe, who is the author of a very, very amazing book. That's the word I keep using, amazing, because of the insight that it brings to anxiety and nervous energy, and more importantly, the exercises that one can work through to resolve these seemingly irreconcilable tensions that we find ourselves facing, those of us who have issues with anxiety. The book is called Nervous Energy: Harness the Power of Your Anxiety. So, Dr. Chloe, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where were you born, and where did you go to school, and what got you into studying psychology, and more particularly, what got you into this issue of anxiety?
Sure. So I was born in Holland, Michigan. And when I was 8 years old, I told everybody I was going to live in New York and be on television. And so thankfully, all of that came true. Though I didn't finish college till a little bit later. I did finish at Columbia University. And then I went on to get my PhD in clinical psychology. You asked as well just how I got into becoming a psychologist and why anxiety. So when I first moved to New York, I was actually teaching yoga. And I was teaching individual lessons, to be quite honest, because that was the best way to pay the bills. New York City is not cheap. And the teaching private lessons was economical for me. So I was teaching private yoga lessons. And as you can imagine, the types of, busy driven New Yorkers that have the drive to take private yoga lessons, they tend to be pretty high functioning people, and they often had a lot of nervous energy. And I would design these custom programs for them that would blend physical postures with, meditations and things to help them achieve whatever particular goals they had. And I got really into that work. And I started getting more and more interested in the mental side of it. And I felt like they were almost imparting a certain level of wisdom to me that I didn't honestly feel like I had, but I wanted it. And so that is what prompted me to go ahead and get my PhD in clinical psychology.
And the anxiety part?
Yeah. So, I think that the people I was working with honestly tended to be more likely to have anxiety issues than depressive issues in the first place. There is a connection between anxiety and depression because anxiety is kind of an excess energy sometimes. It can, that's why its symptoms can be things like racing heart, sweaty palms, mind can't stop, all of those things. And if we don't know how to manage that energy, it can actually kind of become depressing, right? It can lead to depression. One of the hallmark symptoms of depression is actually a sense of helplessness, and it tends to center more around lethargy, a lack of energy. And again, I'm just personally an extremely high energy person. And so I just naturally always gravitated knowing I could be more useful and more helpful with people that were just going to be a little bit more on the higher energy side.
Right, right. That's very interesting. I want to ask you. There's so many questions I want to ask you. I wish this interview could last for 2 hours. But is
Oh,
there
thank you.
is there a correlation between anxiety and past trauma, or is anxiety more of a state of affairs in which one simply feels impotent to deal with the current situation, or are the two combined? Is a feeling of impotence to deal with the current situation linked to some sort of past trauma that produces anxiety?
Yeah, the answer is both, Jason. That's a great question. So, you can absolutely have anxiety even if you have not had a past trauma, because again, everybody has anxiety. There is a healthy function to anxiety. The healthy function to anxiety is to stimulate preparation behaviors. So when people say, I want to get rid of my anxiety, it's like saying, I want to get rid of all my body fat. Like you actually would not want to. A person with no anxiety would not even think to look both ways before they cross the street, right? Now, if somebody had a past trauma and then they we're suffering from anxiety later, the way to respond to that anxiety would obviously vary, by the situation. Because, for example, suppose that I have a past trauma of getting financially taken advantage of, where I constantly get swindled because I believe whatever anybody tells me. And so I've given away all my money and I've had a lot of financial trauma. And now I'm walking around with anxiety because I'm afraid it's going to happen again. That's actually a healthy anxiety. That is stimulating me to realize that I need to learn how to set some, kind of financial firewalls in my life, and, maybe have somebody else have to sign off on my bank before, money goes out. If I just know that I have a tendency left to my own devices, to do irresponsible things with my money. So, now on the other hand, let's suppose that I had a past trauma, again, with, where I got swindled, but it was really truly kind of a once in a lifetime situation. And then I even went the extra step of having extra financial firewalls around me, but I just still had this almost habitual anxiety about that past trauma. And there was no productive action anymore that anxiety could even be stimulating me to take. I was just holding on to the anxiety. In that case, then we would want to treat that anxiety differently with, some soothing statements or some work to help put that experience behind me and to assure myself that I'm strong and capable and safe now. So there's really not a one size fits all answer, but the key is to know that the healthy function of anxiety is to stimulate preparation behaviors. And once you know that, it helps you to decide, is this anxiety stimulating me to take some kind of a preparation behavior? Or do I actually want to divert this energy somewhere else? That's some of the other techniques in the book talk about that, how if we just have kind of residual anxiety about something that's over, we can point that anxiety onto a new project and use it to help get the work done on something else, even if we want to. There's so much more to anxiety than I think a lot of people realize.
As a follow-up to that, Dr. Chloe, are there some parenting styles that are conducive to paralyzing anxiety in children?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it won't surprise anyone to know that helicopter parents, right, can be a kind of anxiety provoking for children, because the children get the message that the world is a dangerous place, and without mommy and daddy constantly orbiting around, then I would be lost, right? That's actually not a strong, empowering, resilient mode for a child to operate in, which I know is very difficult, because helicopter parents are well-meaning. They're investing everything in their children, but they don't realize that sometimes they are buffering their children from the world so much that they're actually depriving their children of the chance to develop that sense of self-efficacy and resiliency. Now, of course, on the other hand, it's very anxiety provoking for children to be around, chaotic parents that are, substance abusers, that sometimes they show up at home, sometimes they don't, and there's no stability in the home because the parents are, so dysfunctional. That obviously creates anxiety for children as well. So I think that unfortunately, there's probably a lot of different ways for parents to inadvertently create anxiety. But again, I just keep harkening back to wanting parents, and I'm a mom myself as well, to know that we're supposed to have a certain amount of anxiety. We don't want to jump to, medicalize or label it. We actually just want to ask, what is the constructive action that this anxiety could be stimulating me to take? If my child is stressing out about a book report, the question is, well, Junior, what have you done about that book report? Show me. Have you made an outline? Have you made a visual aid? Have you made a list of the things that you will do? You know what I mean? You just want to guide them to put that anxiety into constructive action. That's, for most cases. Obviously, there is truly pathological anxiety, but most people don't realize that there's a healthy space with it. And interestingly, if we don't know how to work with anxiety in its healthy space and we stuff it down, we actually become more vulnerable to the pathological kind.
Exactly. And what we do is we medicalize and neutralize people's coping, their creative mechanisms for coming up with solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Um, what is I mean, you spent some time talking about perfectionism and anxiety. What is the root cause of perfectionism in a person? What makes a person a perfectionist?
Well, that probably the answer to that is as numerous as there are people in the world, right? Every person's going to have a different reason, but we do have trait levels of conscientiousness, right? So our desire to pay attention to the details and to do things correctly, right? Also, some people are kind of people pleasers, right? Other people may have a high need for control. So any of those things could certainly, combine into perfectionism. I always, when I'm working with perfectionism, and there is a whole chapter on it in the book, I always try to encourage people to understand that perfectionism many times is actually coming from a good place, to say, we're not talking about getting rid of your drive for excellence, or your desire to do well, or your desire to do the best that you can. In fact, we're just going to give that part of you some new tools so that it can actually really be its best. And so one of the little tricks in that chapter that I kind of mentioned earlier is that when you find yourself encountering something about yourself that you want to change, again, like suppose you're talking too much at a party and you suddenly realize it, instead of berating yourself like a perfectionist would, berating yourself to the point where you end up withdrawing completely from the party and not actually really connecting with people either. Instead, again, you actually want to congratulate yourself on the awareness of the mistake, because that empowers you to look at it. It helps to keep you calm. You realize that awareness of the mistake is better than non-awareness of the mistake. And then you become curious and you say, how could I improve this? Because that's the real goal. And it stops people from getting into a actual time and energy wasting self-berating. It's okay to have self-discipline and self-awareness, but total self-flagellation becomes counterproductive.
How concerned are you, Dr. Chloe, that the healthy kind of anxiety, and I go back to children and adolescents, that can lead to growth, that can lead to creative adaptation, that can lead to the cultivation of capabilities that lead to help problem solving, is being medicalized, is leading to a trauma economy that in the end will stunt really the growth and the imaginative capabilities of children and young people in our society today.
I am extremely, extremely concerned about that. I think, as you said, it's being medicalized. And when it's being medicalized, it's being monetized, right? So there are, big pharma out there that have a financial interest in our children being labeled with, some kind of a quote disorder that they have to take a pill for the rest of their life. They're, in a sense, there's a financial outcome to some corporations to that's more desirable than of our children just learning to say, yeah, you know what, I got a little anxious and got a little turned around there for a minute. And I learned how to have a talk with a friend, or journal, or, read a book and sort things out. And I realized it was actually an opportunity for growth. Nobody makes money when a child goes through that process as much. So, yes, I'm extremely concerned about it. And I hate to say it, but even in my own industry, the mental health field, I think that there's a lot of people that have kind of a savior complex or a hero complex or whatever. And there's something about keeping people hooked on, therapy and their trauma and, their disability that is somehow oddly gratifying unconsciously, I think, to some clinicians. Not to say that, of course, that there is no such thing as genuine lifelong pathological, debilitating anxiety. I'm a clinical psychologist. I obviously know that there is, but I do think that, as you said, that there is a tendency for that to almost be overblown and overdiagnosed right now, perhaps. But there's also a lot of genuine social factors that I mentioned earlier that I think are genuinely troubling our youth.
Well, people are going to read your book and they're going to benefit from it. But in closing, what would you say to parents um, who are observing their children and are trying to figure out? It's very, very difficult, I think, with teenagers who are in flux and are becoming and have a myriad problems and so on and so forth, most of which are ephemeral. What would you say to parents who are trying to decipher the difference between what seems to be just emergent normal anxiety by being a teenager and something that they might suspect could be pathological and real mental health? What are some of the signs that they should be looking for in terms of this is just a normal, healthy part of being an anxious teenager in a world that is going to bombard you with a lot of stimuli and will bring about anxiety versus something that is more pathological?
Mm-hmm. Well, first and foremost, obviously, if a child is ever talking about thoughts of harm to self or others, you obviously want to, get them to see a doctor right away. Um, but other, signs that something maybe serious is happening, which again doesn't necessarily mean something medical per se, but social withdrawal or sudden changes in grades or lack of enjoyment and participation in things that they used to do. One thing that I would suggest trying to find out as well to understand, is this a situational reaction, or is this truly like the child has something in their brain that needs treatment? Is to, if you haven't already, take that child's phone away. I'm very anti-phone for kids. Try seeing how they are, without their phone for a month. Try taking them away for a weekend, just the two of you, and notice if the behavior that is troubling you, that you see in them, this anxiety, notice if it persists and remains the same throughout the weekend, or if once you get them out of that environment into somewhere else and it's just the two of you, do they kind of seem to change back to their normal selves? That would start to help you understand if it's like maybe there's something in their environment that they, maybe need less of, or that they need some coping skills with, or if it's truly a psychological quote, disorder. And again, I really shy away from that disorder word because, as I said, I think a lot of these things are overdiagnosed.
Mm-hmm. One final question, Dr. Clay. I promise you this will be our final question, but I know that a lot of our listeners, I know that a lot of people struggle with this problem that you broached in your book, which is overthinking a problem. How do we know? Because I think there's a cognitive component to emotions, and when we're in the throes of emotions, we're overanalyzing and we're overthinking, and you hear the accusation hurled quite often at people that you're just overthinking something. How do we know what are your thoughts on the whole issue of overthinking a problem? How do you know when you're overthinking something? How do you know when you should desist from sort of like stop over analyzing? I love the way you discuss this in your book, um, and to just sort of act decisively. Or what are your closing thoughts on this phenomenon of which can lead to more anxiety, right? The more you think about a problem, the
Rumination.
rumination, the less likely you are to act in service of the very problem that you're thinking about.
Right. Well, I mean, I think when you have thought about a situation, you've done your pros and cons, you've talked about it with friends, etc. At a certain point, I actually have another exercise where you can even literally check in with your gut, because there is actually some interesting new evidence around how sometimes our bodies and our guts actually have certain types of receptors that can actually be quite informative for us, which is why the old saying, our gut feeling, is helpful. So there are some exercises that people can do about that as well. And then there's also sometimes we just need to learn how to switch our thoughts onto something else. And there is the mental shortlist technique in the book about that as well, where sometimes we just need to commit to a decision on something and then deliberately pivot our thoughts onto something else. And there are some structured ways that we can do that. But if you're really struggling to let go of a particular topic, I think sometimes it can be helpful to journal about the topic and to talk about what it is, that you're afraid of. Or are you afraid of making the wrong decision? Or is there something about the topic that's actually kind of exciting and interesting and you don't want to let it go because you enjoy it? And again, sometimes that can stimulate you to find other ways just to involve yourself in that topic. So it would depend a little bit on the situation, but certainly people with nervous energy do tend to have active thoughts. And so that's what the book is all about, is how to make sure that we point those thoughts in the right direction.
Dr. Chloe, thank you so much. Tell our listeners where they can find you. You have a website, and are you on Twitter? Are you on Facebook? Where can they?
Yes, I'm everywhere. So the easiest way is to go to nervousenergybook.com. So if you go to nervousenergybook.com, it will take you to the page in my website that's all about this book. And through my website, there's also links to all of my social media. I'm all over, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, everywhere. So nervousenergybook.com would be the easiest way.
Easiest way, okay. Well, Dr. Chloe, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on the Jason Hill Show. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've learned a lot from you, from just listening to you, and I've learned a lot by reading the book. The book, everyone, is Nervous Energy, Harness the Power of Your Anxiety by Dr. Chloe Carmichael, published by St. Martin's Press, St. Martin's Essentials. So once again, thank you, Dr. Chloe, and I wish you all the best with your life and with the book as well.
Thank you so much, Jason. It was really a pleasure. I just want you to know how much your words about my book mean to me. Thank you again.
Jason Hill Show is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.